I'm reacting to the undisputed lightweight champion of the world, Devin Haney's strength conditioning methods. Okay, so we're starting off with broad jumps, a very popular tool to improve speed and acceleration, especially a transfer towards different sports, running-based sports that rely on the horizontal impulse, horizontal rate of force development to create speed and acceleration during sprinting. So this is the reason why broad jumps is used in athletic populations. Now with boxing, even though there's a lot of running involved, we need to prioritize vertical impulse. We need to use counter movement jumps, squat jumps, box jumps, anything that optimizes the vertical rate of force development, ground reaction force, and impulse, because this is what transfers more to a punch. Even though a punch is horizontal movement, force demands from the lower body is actually creating vertical impulse. So that's what we want to do within our plyometrics and within our strength conditioning. Broad jump can be used in boxing still if you're working with groups, athletes that can't necessarily perform an optimal counter movement jump. It's a great learning tool to be able to express force. In a strength conditioning setting, look to do counter movement jumps. Now, broad jumps can still be used in boxing. It does have transfers to horizontal force, which can transfer into speed and acceleration in your running. Great to just open up that athletic toolbox. The more skills that you learn, better that this can transfer. Limitations of performing a broad jump though, you're not getting that optimal and maximal hip extension due to the kind of landing forces that you're having to deal with when you're actually landing. So if you look at Devin Haney's technique here, it's actually going boom, quite knee dominant, leaning quite far forward over that foot. So when performing broad jumps at Boxing Science, we actually make a few little tweaks to make sure that you're optimizing the safety and effectiveness of broad jumps. What we like to do is to perform this with an altitude landing first and then drive into the broad jump. Now, the reason why we use this is to increase the eccentric demands, which we know that we need to do with boxers to create that elasticity of the lower body. But what this also does, increase the vertical demands, vertical impulse demands, and be able to control them forces and then reproduce. So this transfers more into boxing. But also what it does is reduces the amount of distance that you can cover in your broad jump, which will reduce the amount of forces that you have to control in that landing position. So the less distance or less forces that you have to control, which will encourage you to jump further and produce more force at the jump, but will also make it a lot safer at the end. So this is increasing safety and effectiveness. A little tweak that you can do is do it with bands. So adding the band around the hips will force the boxer to increase that hip extension forces, driving through, working towards the adaptations that we're actually wanting. At the end, they're not going to be able to produce as much distance, which will then further reduce them impact forces when you're landing into the broad jump. And also with the band pulling you back, will encourage the athlete to drop into that squat position more, pushing the hips back. When using broad jumps, add a little bit of vertical element to it, dropping down into an altitude landing into the broad jump, and then adding a band to it. This will increase the safety and the effectiveness of performing broad jumps within your strength conditioning program. So the Viking Press landmine attachment, fantastic tool. We use it a lot at Boxing Science. What I would say about this is not really getting that full extension. I think it's performing quite a few reps on this as well. It looks quite light, so it looks like it could be like an upper body conditioning tool, which is difficult, can improve your upper body conditioning. But let's talk more about this Viking Press landmine attachment. So great tool that we have down at Boxing Science. We use it for a range of activities, whether that's heavy pressing, doing it from a split stance, or performing landmine split jerks. Now the reason why it's such a good tool is because the landmine press is an excellent exercise for boxers, because boxers struggle overloading the shoulders due to being quite tight in the shoulders, being quite overactive. So when they're doing overhead pressing, putting the shoulder in a compromised position, but also they look to compensate using the flaring of the rib cage, using the lower back muscles, because they're quite limited in their overhead range. Now what the landmine does, increase that kind of shoulder activation through pressing action, but also not putting our back into a compensated position and putting our shoulder in a vulnerable position. So this is a much safer and effective way to load up the shoulders. Now what we normally do is do single arm, which is beneficial for working on the muscular imbalances. But what the Viking attachment does is really help us load up that action, that pressing action overhead. So we can go from a bilateral point of view, working on both shoulders at the same time, start adding increased weight load over that, So you can really strengthen up that pressing action, primarily using your shoulders and your triceps. So performing box jumps here, repeated. This looks like it might be a conditioning drill, but if he's looking to optimize kind of speed adaptations, probably do this from a lower box, just to make sure that he's maintaining that ground contact time. He's looking like his feet are really stuck to the floor as he's bouncing up, back up. Look, he needs high explosive power to be able to do this. But I would say is to try and go a little bit lower, so then he's really optimizing that ground contact time, because this is really important for reactive strength. As soon as you go higher, this will increase ground contact time, which will reduce kind of then adaptations, what you want in out of plyometric exercises. Box jumps, I normally start from a dead start, focus on kind of using that multi-joint movement, express force through like a half squat in action or full squat in action, to then transfer into increases of rate of force development, rather than looking at reactive strength. The more reactive strength work that I do is done through pogos. We do box jumps, but we'll do depth jumps, where we're jumping from one box to the other, looking for the rapid, short ground contact time. A few little tweaks that I do to this one, necessarily to change the drill altogether, but what I would say is to just reduce the height of the box to make sure that you're optimizing that ground contact time at the bottom. Ab rollouts, a fantastic exercise to develop the core strength, anti-extension, something that we use in more or less every single program that we do at Boxing Science. Now, what I would say with barbells, I've actually kind of moved away from. Devin Haney here, probably showing the reasons why. It's quite hard on the shoulders, hard to get that balance there. So you can see there that it's really shrugging up the shoulders there to maintain the kind of balance of the bar. It's also going a little bit too far as well. What I do with ab wheel rollouts is create an 80-20 rule, where we don't go from 0 to 100, optimizing them positions, keeping the rib cage down, make sure that keeping the glutes tense, essentially increasing core activation and core control all the way through the movement. Is going all the way back, flexing the hips. When he gets to that position there, he's not really got that core tension. If we go to 20% and we stay over the bar there, we're keeping that core switched on all the time. Keep that time under tension, which is really important in core muscle strength and retaining that lean mass of the core. And then when he goes to 100, he's dropping down, his shoulders are shrugging, and also is losing that control of the lower back, essentially training your lower back instead of training your core muscles. So good variations to use is doing TRX rollouts, but essentially doing ab wheel rollouts is the best way now to perform this activity, more shoulder friendly, and also increasing core activation as well. So we've got pull off press walks with the band, brilliant exercise to use. It's increasing that oblique activation as he's stepping out, increasing the tension as he's going out. It's keeping his shoulders back and down to a decent level. And as he steps, the very, very controlled steps. So you're getting some glute med activation here as well. So this variation, I think he's using, is it a towel? It's like a clip with a towel. Could be decent for like grip strength as well, creating that tension. Don't know, I'll probably have to have a go at that and nick that myself. It's probably increasing upper body bias, but also reducing the amount of kind of weight load that you can push against the band and use your weight load as momentum. So I'll have to play around with that. I think that it could benefit when you're gripping, you're not going too elevated with the shoulders. Normally what we do, put the band to the outside of the hand. The reason why we do this is to limit that pec activation, pulling against it, reducing that shoulder activation, pulling against the band. Also, when you go to the outside of the band here, recruiting activation from your posterior shoulder around your rotator cuff muscles, linked with the core, will help improve shoulder health and increase core activation, oblique activation during this exercise as well. So we've got lunge and rotate, which is a fantastic exercise that we use as a mobility exercise. So we use it as part of our warm-up routine. Now, what I would say here is that the technique is lacking a little bit. I don't really want to be too negative about the technique. Don't want to be negative towards the athlete or the coaches that are running it. There's something here that I can like kind of educate you guys on, because this is something that I see quite often when performing this exercise with an athlete for the first time. Doing like kind of lunge and rotate, what you're wanting to do, keep the lower body stable and trying to rotate that upper body as much as you can. This will help improve rotational mobility, flexibility of the hip flexors, glute med activation, increasing upper body and lower body separation, which is really important for kinetic chain sequencing as we're transferring the force from the foot all the way through to the face. You want your body to be working as one. Devin Haney is rotating really fast and he's losing that control. His knees moving out, his hips dropping in, and also his side bending lower body. So he's got a lot of compensatory patterns here rather than being nice and controlled. I would say to go more controlled, slower repetitions, making sure that you're keeping that lower body stable. I would say to take the weight plate, I'd say that weight plate there is about 10 or 15 kilos. So I'd take the weight down. We'd normally perform this either with just the mini bands, a foam roller, or with a very light weight plate, something like 2.5 or 5 kilo. Having them arms extended will help posterior shoulder activation and also kind of that postural control and stability. And also giving yourself a target as you're rotating round to try and keep the sternum and the chest aligned with that weight all the way through that movement. We've got some trap bar deadlifts, tool that we use a lot at Boxing Science. Another tool that we use is using it with the bands. This is accommodating resistance, which means that you're increasing the amount of force towards the end range of the lift. Now, this is really beneficial for maximum strength, acceleration, and rate of force development during your lifting. And also working towards that end range as well, which is really important if you think about the hip extension forces that you need to transfer lower body force into a punching action. Really, really important. And we also do accommodating resistance on upper body pressing exercises. So what I would say about this technique here that Devin Haney is doing, very, very common with athletes. As soon as they start doing accommodated resistance work and banded work, they take the weight plates off, actually underloading that movement. What you want to do is do it really controlled to make sure that you're still targeting them strength and speed adaptations. We performed a bit of a case study at Boxing Science where we're looking at where we should be loading our athletes when performing accommodating resistance. And what we actually found was that we should be aiming for equivalent load of anywhere between 85 to 90% of their 1 rep max, because we found that this increases acceleration throughout the lift and also increases momentum throughout the lift as well. Acceleration and momentum are key contributors to punching force. Now, what we see in lighter lifts, obviously, is increasing acceleration, but the magnitude of difference isn't that much compared to heavier lifts. So to really get the optimal adaptations out of your accommodative resistance training, you want to be aiming to be quite heavy. Like we said, the optimal for our athletes is between 85 and 90% 1 rep max. This might differ with the athletes that you work with or yourselves. You might be wanting to go about 80% 1 rep max, but certainly that you don't want to be doing is going really, really light on this. The heavier that you go, the better, because this will increase your acceleration rate of force development, transfer into harder punches. Conditioning techniques. This is quite interesting, something that I've seen him do quite a lot. I have good communication with fighters that I work with, and I get sent this video and they say, what's he doing here and everything. Well, what is he doing here is on like some sort of like explosive leg press machine. I think it must be elasticated or hydraulic resistance. Victor Conte says here that is actually increasing the amount of resistance at the top end of the lift, which is fantastic because that transfers to like accommodating resistance training, as we've just said, beneficial for boxing performance. To do this as part of his conditioning drills, I probably have to see it myself, and I've got it myself to truly understand the benefits of this, but I would say that there's probably better ways to doing it because it's high force outputs, high eccentric outputs as is catapulted back towards the platform. You can see that his knees are like kind of buckling and his knees are kind of going in here. Could he do some better off-feet conditioning? Potentially. It depends how long he's doing it for, whether it's for 10, 15, 20 seconds. I think if he's doing it over shorter intervals, that would be more beneficial. If he's doing it over longer ones, high forces coming down into that leg press, I think that would be quite problematic around his joints. When doing off-feet conditioning, I think it's quite beneficial to use the altitude system. So he's set at 14% altitude, which is bang on, really like 14%. It's not too dangerous. It's not that limiting in terms of intensity. Also enough to create higher cardiovascular demands. So we use the Power Breathe altitude systems to perform altitude training to help increase the cardiovascular demands whilst performing high intensity interval training sessions and our muscle buffering sessions. Now, we normally do this on the curve. Could be certain scenarios where we have to do off-feet conditioning with our athletes, either to reduce that training load, especially towards the back end of camp, or maybe even at the start of camp when they're coming in a little bit heavier, or if they're carrying like any injuries or anything like that. Especially towards the back end of camp, boxers may struggle to be stimulated enough on a watt bike or an air bike alone to create them physical adaptations because they're so fit and created a lot of fitness adaptations using the curve to then transfer onto a bike or a watt bike or an air bike. They might find it quite hard to meet their levels of intensity, to elevate the heart rate into the red zone or if they're targeting muscle buffering adaptations to hit high enough intensity to create the blood lactate scores that we need to target muscle buffering capacity adaptations. So we use the watt bike and the air bike in the power breathe altitude systems tend to create higher cardiovascular demands to then elevate the heart rate or elevate the blood lactate levels to meet them physical adaptations. And this is something that Devin Haney is doing quite well here. He's using something that's off feet to reduce them impact forces, but using the altitude system to increase them physical demands to then increase the likelihood of physical adaptations. Banded ice skaters, fantastic tool to use. It's something that we use quite often at Boxing Science. We use ice skaters in most of our sessions. Using the bands is a fantastic way to overload the forces during the landing phase of doing ice skaters. Now what this does is challenge hip stability a little bit more, trunk stability as well. So this can increase activation of the core, but more importantly, activation of the glute and glute med. As we're dragging our athlete across into that ice skater, having to increase with them force demands laterally, we're needing to push our hips back, get into better joint position, but also really push through the floor and increase activation of the glute and glute med. So this is a fantastic exercise to use, and we use it quite often. Do it with an athlete to start off with. You can do it just focusing on the landing mechanics, so dragging them in and performing manual resistance with the bands. But then also you can get them set up against anchor point like Devin Haney is doing here and doing it reactive, because obviously when you're increasing the demands laterally, it's then harder to control, and then it's harder to then reproduce that force. So then you're overloading that lateral movement action, which can really transfer into explosive boxing performance. So this is a fantastic move, kettlebell lateral lunge, getting out of that sagittal plane, really opening up the hips, targeting strength of the bent leg, quads, glute med, but also improving mobility of the adductors. So this is something that we'd use in one of our strength and conditioning sessions, also use it as part of our warm-up. A few different ways that I'd tweak this. Now, sometimes we would do it in a goblet position, but what I find is that boxers will be quite limited in the amount of load that they'll be able to produce on this. The reason why is that the kettlebell, if it's too heavy, will force our athlete into rounding of the shoulders or leaning forward. Boxers will find it quite hard to perform lateral lunges anyway with a nice straight back. Adding the weight here will make that even harder. As a mobility standpoint, is to press the weight out. So using a 5 or 2.5 kilo weight plate, this is what we perform during our warm-ups. But if you're doing this as a key exercise, doing it with a landmine or using a kettlebell, I'd say using the opposite arm to what the bent leg is, be able to lift more weight whilst keeping in that neutral posture, being able to keep them shoulders retracted as well. Fantastic exercise to use, a few little tweaks to optimize the mobility of this, but also to perform the amount of load that you can lift to increase strength adaptations. Okay guys, so that's the end of this reaction video for Devin Haney. Overall, I think he's a great athlete, fantastic boxer. Just a few things that I tweak in terms of his training and his techniques. It's very open to strength and conditioning and sports science. He's been over at the snack facility for quite a while now. I've seen numerous of his videos, and this video here is primarily done from one training session. So we could end up even doing a part 2 either later on in the year or as he progresses through his career, because this guy's got a huge future, especially if he keeps working as hard as he does, but also being open to new techniques. If you liked the content, please hit the like button. If you're not a subscriber yet, hit the subscribe button so you can see all of our content, not only the Boxing Science Reacts, but also the workouts and the exercise techniques that we use down here at the Boxing Science Performance Center. And then if you're liking the React series so far, you need to go and check out all our other videos, such as Lomachenko, Golovkin, Canelo, Verte, Bivol reaction videos. And if you're wanting to make a suggestion of a superstar that we need to cover for the present or of the past, please make suggestions in the comment box below and let us know what you think of Devin Haney's training methods. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully see you on the next episode of Boxing Science Reacts.